Welcome to 1202, the Human Factors Podcast. The podcast that covers all things about humans, technology, and particularly the bit in between.
Welcome to this episode. Today we are talking about the workplace and particularly its fitness for purpose. But before we meet today's guest, a quick reminder that you can help others find this content by commenting on it and sharing this content on whatever platform you're using. It helps others find it and broadens the discussion about the application of human factors. Today's office can look and sound fairly common and generic, really, no matter who you work for. Desks are desks, monitors are monitors, and keyboards are keyboards, and we all have to do our annual DSE assessment. But what about these looks and sounds if they're not the same for you? What else if you have a sight and hearing issue? How can we do things differently so we can provide the best working environment for these people? So today we're joined by Dan Williams from Visualise Training Consultancy, based in Cardiff, and is specialist in promoting and enabling inclusion, accessibility and equality for people living with visual impairment, hearing loss and other forms of disability. So without further ado, Dan, welcome to the podcast and thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you, Barry. It's a pleasure to be part of the podcast today, and that was a great introduction. Thank you.
It's so people get to know a bit more about you. I mean, we know that you've done webinars and stuff for the CIHF before and things like that. But what is your current role? Tell us a bit more about what you do on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah, so I'm the director of Visualise Training and Consultancy, and I work with employers, occupational health providers, and HR professionals to get people back to work if they've got a visual or hearing loss, or also retain work if they've got a visual or hearing loss. But I also do a lot of awareness training to organizations around vision and hearing loss to make the workplace a better place and to promote sort of inclusion within the workplace from an employee perspective, but also a customer service perspective as well.
That's really cool. So how did you get involved in that in the first place? Well, what was the lightning bolt moment for you?
I suppose for me, I was diagnosed at the age of 8 with a hereditary condition called retinitis pigmentosa, which is a gradual loss of vision. Mm-hmm. And I sort of, as I got older and I realized that my job, I wanted to be a police officer. Then I realized that I couldn't be a police officer because I would be a rubbish police officer trying to catch criminals and not being able to chase them. So then I sort of realized that I had to change my outlook on life. And when I was about 16, 17, all my friends started to be able to drive and they were looking at careers. And I sort of thought, yeah, I'm going to be in the police. That's what I'm going to do. And then I realized that's not going to be possible for me. So I had to really take check and take sort of look at what my career was going to be like. I then went to college, I went to mainstream school. I then went to college in Hereford, which was the Royal National College for the Blind. And I met some inspirational people, never met a blind person before, and sort of thought that I was the only one in the world, quite honestly. And when I went there, it made me realize that there's lots of people out there that had visual impairment, and but they were still cracking on and doing things and not letting their disability affect them or stop them. So that really inspired me to basically, it helped me, well, first of all, it helped me with my mental health because I realized I wasn't the only one. I realized that there was opportunity. I realized that I could still do things. I just have to see, realize that I'm just seeing in a different way. So that was really important for me. I had counseling and I had therapy, but the most important thing was to meet other people. And so then I was so inspired that I done my business course. I done sociology and I done health and social care. And I then went on to university to study as a rehabilitation worker for people with visual impairment. And that's teaching people how to cook again, how to clean again, how to get out and about again using a long cane. And that job so it's effectively like an occupational therapist, but for people with visual impairment. But I didn't want to go into working in local authority because there was a lot of red tape. Okay. I've always been quite entrepreneurial. And so I thought, let me set up my own business. Because when I was at that college, I realized there was a huge lack of awareness around visual impairment. So I set up my own business and I've never looked back since. I'm nearly in my 9th year anniversary in April. And I started off doing a lot of awareness training to sort of bus companies, hotels around visual impairment. And ever since then, it's sort of grown into different aspects, really. I started doing access to work assessments for a couple of years for them. And now we do other assessments in hearing loss as well. People kept asking me, can you do hearing as well? So we've now grown our team to have hearing specialists as well. And I suppose what I'm really proud about is the team that I have. There's 7 of us on the team, and we've all got lived experience of either visual impairment or hearing loss. And I think that's really, really important, especially when carrying out an assessment, because people they think they're on their own in the workplace because there may not be anyone that looks like them. But once you sort of do the assessment and you recommend lots of different solutions and you tell them about things that they're unaware of, they realize that they're not the only ones. And they also realize that they're not even the only ones in their organization, because you might have gone to that same organization a few times and you've got a few people maybe upstairs or downstairs who have a visual or hearing loss as well.
That's really fascinating, because you've basically taken what life gave you in that respect and really empowered not only yourself, but you're empowering other people to be able to do basically what we wouldn't expect anybody to do, and to show them that it's that it's open for them. But it must be really good for employers as well, because it shows that how much value you can get out of people if you just give them the right setup. So I guess to get into that, we have workplace assessments, and I think probably most people are familiar with a workplace assessment of some description. But just in case we're not, before we get into the specifics around it, can you just describe what a workplace assessment is and why it's important?
Yeah, so a workplace assessment in my world is to look at what difficulty somebody's having and recommend solutions so that they can continue working or have some adaptations or reasonable adjustments for them to make their job easier effectively. So that's sort of, in a nutshell, that's what it is. And I think from my perspective, we're looking at what difficulties they're having, not just in the workplace, but at home as well, because it starts at, can you do your shopping? Can you do this? What referrals do we need to make so that we can enable you to do that? And also, have you had emotional support to deal with your loss of either vision or hearing? Because people go through a loss the same way that you go through a bereavement, you go through grief, you go through loss, but you can't get to acceptance until you've had some type of therapy or some type of input from other people that have gone through a similar experience.
So you really have to take a holistic approach to this. Then you can't just sort of say, well, there's a special keyboard or a mouse like we could do with other things. You really have to look at the whole package. So I guess to talk about the specifics around this, then what sort of interventions or without being obvious, but what are the challenges around vision or hearing loss? So somebody like myself who can't necessarily appreciate the things. What sort of things would I not be thinking about?
I think the first thing to realize is that 5% of people who are registered blind see nothing at all. So that is that 95% of people that are registered blind will see something, and that might be shapes, shadows. It might be peripheral vision, so they've got the vision at the side but not in the center, or they've got tunnel vision, for example, so not the peripheral vision at the side. And it's but various different eye conditions will affect various different people's level of vision. And someone who's maybe had a stroke may only have they may have a hemanopia, so they may only see, for example, on one side rather than on the other side. So I think it's very variable, and the same with hearing loss. You may get people that are born deaf, capital D deaf, and they may use sign language, for example, and to the other end you may get someone that's just got mild hearing loss or tinnitus that is impacting them in the workplace, but they still need some level of adjustments, and those adjustments might seem very minor, but they may be really, really important to that individual. So yeah.
So what sort of then, if you're looking in the workplace, and I'd like to come back and talk about the home again in a second.
Yeah.
What sort of rectifications and accommodations could we be talking about? How do we make how can we make the workplace easier? I guess it will depend on person to person, won't it? But
Yeah.
do we have any large handful, I guess, solutions?
Yeah, I think so. So, for example, we might be recommending things like a large print keyboard where the letters are bigger on the keyboard, or a larger screen, for example, or a monitor arm so someone can bring the screen closer to their face so they're not bending forward. One of the biggest things I find is that people bend forward to the screen to see the screen because they're not seeing properly. But the amount of people that are not even aware that they're not seeing properly, but do that anyway.
Right.
So,
okay.
Well, from an ergonomic perspective, a lot of people bend forward to the screen. They've probably never been for an eye test, but they just bend subconsciously to the screen. And they never necessarily think that they're bending to the screen because they're not seeing properly. They just think they're bending forward to the screen. So the first question I would be asking in that situation is, have you been for an eye test? When was the last time you went for an eye test? Because you don't generally bend into the screen unless you're not seeing properly.
Okay.
And I think there needs to be that connection with ergonomics and vision, very, very important. And I think from an ergonomic perspective, that question should be asked all the time. When was the last time you went for your eye test? Because if you've got a gradual loss of vision, you don't necessarily know that you're losing your sight. And it's quite scary, the amount of people that I am aware of that continue to drive and they're not seeing properly, or they didn't realize they had a sight problem until they knocked over somebody, or they didn't know they had a sight problem until they bashed into the wall.
Yeah.
Because people don't necessarily, 28% of the population don't bother going for eye tests, and employers don't generally push eye tests as good as they should or could. So I slightly digress there, but I just wanted to get that point across.
No, it's a really good point, because I mean, what we found with my younger daughter is that she was, she loved reading and that, and you could sort of see like the book was going closer and closer and all this sort of stuff. And but it wasn't until, but she never complained about not being able to see properly and things like that. But when she went to when we sort of said, oh well, maybe you should go for an eye test. It wasn't something that we'd push straight away, but we went along. She then got glasses, and turns out she had really bad eyesight. And that moment of when she put the glasses on, when she got the glasses, put them on, it's like, oh, this is what I'm supposed to be saying. And it's you don't know what you don't have until you kind of see, I guess, the solution. So and then it's like you say, I guess the responsibility on us as employers to be able to turn around and say, it's not just how well are you feeling today, but have you had a hearing test, sight test, and them sort of things. Just it's all preventative, isn't it?
Yeah, and we know prevention is better than cure as well. So 50% of sight loss, for example, is avoidable, and that can be avoidable in a number of ways. For example, wearing sunglasses. Hearing loss again is avoidable, not putting headphones up to maximum volume, not wearing contact lenses in the swimming pool or the shower, basic things that could make a massive difference. But it's that eye health promotion isn't really being done so much. But also in terms of recommendations, we might recommend larger screen, but we might also recommend a smaller screen. The amount of times I go into employers and someone has a visual impairment and they recommend a massive screen. Obviously, a massive screen from an ergonomic perspective isn't the best solution all the time, because then you get people moving their head from left to right, and they get a bad neck, they get bad back, etc., and it can sometimes cause more problems. But if somebody's only got a reduced peripheral vision of field, for example, there's no point in getting them a massive screen because they can only see at this level anyway.
Right.
Depends on someone's level of vision. Whereas if someone's got reduced central vision, so the center of the vision, and they're only using their peripheral vision at the side, then it makes more sense to have a larger screen. So it's all about taking all that into account when making recommendations. And I've seen assessments where people have been recommended the wrong equipment, and it's actually ended up in them having more MSK issues than actually they didn't need in the first place. So that's really, really important, I think, to highlight to the listeners today that, bigger is not always better when it comes to visual impairment, especially. And then in terms of hearing loss, we will be recommending things like if someone has tinnitus, then we might be recommending tinnitus management therapy to help people manage the tinnitus. It might be recommending phonak Roger equipment, which is sort of listening equipment that can attach to the hearing aids and amplify sound. We might be recommending sort of louder headphones so that people can hear better or that can attach to their hearing aids. We might be recommending some deaf awareness training or some visual impairment awareness training for the colleagues that are working with that specific colleague to make them more aware of how to support them in the workplace. So it's very, and we might be then recommending that somebody has, for example, the fire service come to their home because they might need a vibrating pillow or they might need a flashing alarm at home to know if there's a fire, for example, because again, if there's a fire at home, how do they know it? How do they know the alarm's going off? And the same in the workplace, things like this, but again, making a huge difference to their home life and their work life. So it's very, very holistic. We look at what difficulties the person's having at home, at work, social life. I've had people confide in me about they're in domestic violent relationships, so I might have to refer them for domestic violence support, etc., etc. The list goes on. I sort of see myself as a workplace social worker when it comes to vision and hearing, not just a workplace assessor, because at the end of the day, I'm dealing with a person that's got difficulties in their life, and I feel like I need to help them in whatever way I can. And a lot of the professionals that these people are seeing along their journey, so it might be they see a GP, then an ophthalmologist or an audiologist or an optometrist, you would think that they would have referred them somewhere along that process. But unfortunately, that doesn't generally happen because a lot of people slip through the net. So I sometimes will pick up people and say, why haven't you been referred here or here or here? Well, so yeah, I think the other piece of work that I do is a lot of work with income protection insurers. So when people are off work for a long period of time, the insurer is paying their salary. And interestingly, historically, a lot of insurers were sort of, if somebody had a visual impairment and the ophthalmologist said they're registered blind, then the insurer would just pay out the claim. But more and more insurers are coming to us now and saying, we want to get these people back into work. We don't want, just because you have a visual impairment, you shouldn't need to just be claiming income protection. And most people want to work. Most people don't just want to claim income protection because, they've been working for 20, 30 years. They don't necessarily want to be signed off for another 30 years until they retire because they've got all those skills to give to their employer. And if they're just sat at home doing nothing, then it increases their mental health as well. So it's really, really important to acknowledge that as well, really.
And is it because what you're really assessing them for is quite personal, isn't it? You maybe have delivered almost a revelation to them in many ways, and so it's quite close. Therefore, I can really appreciate why then they would feel they can open up to you about other things as well. So again, it feeds into that holistic service you describe, and you can see it's not just go in, do this, get out again, do the next job. You must get really sort of involved, for want of a better expression.
Yeah, and I think having a visual impairment, when I do, because I do the visual ones and my colleagues do the hearing ones, but when having a visual impairment or a hearing loss, when people realize that you've got that as well, they naturally seem to open up more to you because they sort of feel like you understand it because you're coming from their perspective. Even though I'm never going to understand how everybody feels, I just have a more empathic approach and I understand where they're coming from. So that's really, really, I think, important. And, the amount of people that you're the first person that they've really opened up to, the amount of assessments that I've done where it turns into a crying session, my assessment might be 2 hours, 3 hours, it takes how it will take because you've got a person there that needs support and that might be the only time that they've ever had support from you. So that's sort of where I stand on the quality of assessment. Really, it's about having a quality assessment, making sure the person gets what they need. And then on the other side, making sure that the employer implements the adjustments. And sometimes that's a difficulty because you don't have control over what the employer then goes to do with your report.
Okay.
Sometimes that report might sit on the HR manager's desk or a line manager's desk for a year, or it might sit on there for a week, and you might get some people that are more proactive than others in implementing the adjustments. So that's sometimes where I think the workplace adjustment process can fall down.
Right. Okay. I guess it's the kicking people to implement what goes on. Obviously we've gone through COVID and all the joys that had to offer. How did that change how you work? Because I guess there's two aspects. One is, the restrictions that were in place meant getting close to people made it difficult, but also we were doing more. We were working from home. So what were the differences that you saw in that respect?
I think to be honest, I never thought that we could do an assessment online. So it's changed my sort of mindset slightly that we can do an assessment online. We can do an assessment over the phone. And I always thought that it was never going to be possible. I think the only thing that might have changed slightly is that you don't get the human contact or the emotional connection as much, I think, if you're not face to face with somebody.
Yeah.
Will open up more to you emotionally when you're in the same room as them. So I would say that's probably the biggest thing in terms of, and I think you can see things a bit better from like the body language, and people will tell you, oh no, I'm fine, I'm okay, I'm fine. But actually, that if you were there, it would probably be easier to see that they're about to break down right now, because you've just sort of you brought everything to the surface of what they're experiencing in their grief process. So I think that's probably the biggest thing. But in terms of doing the assessment, I think to most of the time, we split it between hybrids. So sometimes we'll do assessments face to face, sometimes we'll do them online, depending on the requirement. But I think it's made me realize that we can do a lot more and be more efficient in terms of time, but also from my own perspective of traveling around the UK, I was getting knackered myself, because it is tiring traveling around doing assessments all week. And I think it was my lifestyle is a lot better now from a work-life balance perspective, which I think is really important as a director running your own business as well.
No, that's I should do a lot better at that than I do. What did you find in terms of when you were not just conducting the assessments, but in terms of, I guess, the accommodations, the solutions you were offering? Because when we've talked to people around being home working, there was some what I could only consider ridiculous setups where people were working off ironing boards, even working off the dining room table for months and months and months on end. Is not a solution. So what sort of how easy or how difficult was it for you to get solutions into the home as opposed to the office?
I think it depended on the employer, but I think some employers were taking ownership of it and some weren't. I think some employers were saying, well, it's your responsibility, we'll send you the equipment, for example, but you've got to set it up yourself. And I think, again, for some people, especially on the vision side, that was difficult, especially if they're living on their own, for example, to read the instructions, etc., to pull it out of the box, to fit it up.
Yeah.
There's an expectation that everybody can do that, whether it's a desk, for example, everyone can set up a desk. Well, not everybody can. And I don't think that's just from a visual impairment perspective. I think that's just generally not everybody can do X, Y, and Z. So I think there was an assumption that everybody could do it, and some people needed that additional support or additional help, and there was a lack of that, I would say. But what I have seen more and more is that people are required more and more now to go back into the office, and that's great. But then equally, on the flip side, some people are also working from home, and I think more and more people with disabilities, some people are working from home because the employer thinks it would be easier for them, so they wouldn't have to commute to the office. But then equally on the flip side, they then miss out on the social sort of contact with colleagues as well. So it's trying to get that balance. And I think it's really important to ask the employee what would work better for them, rather than assume that maybe just because they have a disability, it's going to be easier for them to work from home.
No, that makes an awful lot of sense, because, and I guess not only is everybody's individual circumstance different, but everybody's home is different as well. It's but that reflectiveness around employers is, I think, really, it's really interesting, because every employer's got different challenges. But what if you could wave the magic wand and get all employers to behave in the way that you would wish? What would that look like? What can employers be doing differently to what they're doing now?
I think to have an assessment, to have a proper specialist assessment, because I have seen assessments where, every assessor has a specific skill set. Yeah. So if you come from an ergonomics background and that's what you specialize in, then you will generally be good at that, right? I'm not great at ergonomics, so I don't generally I wouldn't do an ergonomic assessment. I will refer that out to somebody that I know that can do that.
Yeah.
So I think, but on the flip side, I've seen assessments for vision and hearing where they've been recommending like very inappropriate recommendations. For example, dyslexia software, and the person doesn't have dyslexia. They have a visual impairment, for example.
Right.
And like other things, like a really large screen when they're only seeing a small amount anyway. So I think it's really important to get a specialist assessment, and then I think it's really important to sit down with the employee and the line manager and the HR team and come up with an implementation plan to get those adjustments in place quickly in a reasonable time frame, and pay for the adjustments and get that person on their feet quickly, because the amount of employers that will drag the whole process out when it doesn't really need to be. Who's paying for this, who's paying for that, you can pay for this and you can pay for that, and in the meantime that employee is struggling then for another month and another month and another month goes on, and their mental health then dwindles, and then they get signed off sick because they can't cope anymore with the stress of all of this, managers talking about them, and then they feel like, who's gonna, and then the employee thinks, I'm really, I don't want my employee to pay for this because this piece of equipment's too expensive, and then they feel, then that gets them feeling down as well. So I think it's really, really important to just, let's be fair, if you're a multi-million-pound company, to pay a grand or $2,000 on a couple of pieces of equipment to get somebody back on their feet, what's the big deal, really? I mean, you can get that done pretty quickly. So it doesn't make sense to me sometimes, the drawn out processes that some employers will do. And then on the flip side, you've got employers that they'll have the assessment, they'll get everything in place within a matter of weeks, and the person's then rocking and rolling and on their feet. And that's what I call a really inclusive employer. And I think that, to me, should be the gold standard of where we should be working to. And they don't make the individual feel like they're sort of a problem, like, Barry, I'm gonna have to spend loads of money on you, you're causing me a problem, this piece of equipment's this amount of money, because that has a massive impact on the individual. Has a massive impact, because then they feel less than they feel like a second-class citizen, and something, and like they shouldn't need to feel like that. At the end of the day, sight loss or hearing loss could happen to any person at any point in their life. At the end of the day, if that person needs help and support, just give them the help and support they need. Don't make it a bigger issue than it needs to be. If you've got to put some money into the pot, then just and I'm talking about companies that can afford this, and I think if you really value your employees, I mean, I'm a small company, and if I value my employees, I'll pay for whatever they need, because I don't have oozes of money, but at the end of the day, if I need to get someone rocking and rolling and back on their feet, and I value my employee, then I'm going to do it. It's just morally right. I think sometimes we think too much about the law.
Right.
Sometimes people just need to take a rain check and think, what's morally right here? Like, what should I do? Do you know what I mean? Because if I was in that situation, of course I would want everything that I need to be able to work. we talk about Equality Act and we talk about legislation, but I think we need to start changing the conversation to be more about what do I need to do to get this person back on their feet, whatever it might be.
And fundamentally, the bottom line for a business is if somebody is motivated, enthused, and able to do their job, then that builds the bottom line, doesn't it? Which makes it an investment rather than a cost.
Yeah.
So if people need this sort of help, where can they find it? Because obviously doing this sort of workplace assessment is not a standard workplace assessment. You need, as you've very eloquently highlighted, you need a specialist to come in and do this. Where are you the only company in the UK that does this, or where we find help?
So we're one of the only ones. There are some of the charities that do it as well, and there is Access to Work. So I used to do Access to Work assessments, but then they wanted us to do everything. So ergonomics, dyslexia, visual impairment, everything. So I come away from that because I was an expert in this area, not everything else, and I didn't want to do that. So you have a choice at the end of the day. Everybody has a choice. You can either go via the government scheme or you can go private for an assessment. With the delays in Access to Work at the moment, 6 to 8 months delay for an assessment is just not really fair on the employee either.
Yeah.
So it depends on your routes of how you will do it, really. But with Access to Work, I think people don't realize the difference as well between a private assessment and an Access to Work assessment, which is interesting because people understand the differences between the NHS and the private system. And that's how I would sort of compare it. It's a similar thing. So the difference is with us, you'd get a specialist assessor and someone with lived experience. With Access to Work, you get an assessor that is experienced in an area, but then also has to do other assessments in areas that they're not necessarily experienced in. The assessment might last half an hour to 45 minutes, and you will get a report. But it's very focused on the technology. It's not going to focus on your home life and the mental health aspects of everything else that's going on in your journey, your hearing loss or sight loss journey. And so that's sort of the differences in that. And then obviously the time delay as well is a difference. So we can turn it around within about 10 days, an assessment process. I think, it just gives people that option. So we're not the only option. There are other options.
No, that's really good, and thank you for being so I guess candid with how this is a process that is really important to go through.
Just before Barry gets to the final three, my name's Nick Rome. Let me tell you about this. Technology in our world is evolving at a phenomenal pace, and keeping up with what that means in the human factors world can be challenging. That's where Human Factors Cast comes in. Human Factors Cast is a weekly podcast that highlights and breaks down stories that are chosen by you, the Human Factors community.
New York State is giving out hundreds of robots as companions for the elderly.
Buttons in cars are safer and quicker to use than touchscreen.
A prototype just achieved a major milestone that actually fits the description of a flying car.
The show provides perspective based on experiences from different domains and different industries. We even cover some of the hottest conferences in the field. On this episode, we're recapping EHF, Ergonomics and Human Factors Conference, Neuroergonomics Conference, Human Factors and Ergonomics Society, UXPA International. Join me, Nick Rome.
And me, Barry Kirby.
Every Friday morning when Human Factors Cast drops on YouTube and your favorite podcast directory. And remember,
it depends.
And now I'm going to send it back over to Barry for the final three.
Generally, do you have a resource or a book or anything like that you go back to repeatedly?
I suppose a book. I'm constantly looking at suppliers' catalogs to keep up to date. New technologies and new softwares, and going to conferences to keep up to date with everything that's going on in the ever-changing sort of AI world and technology world, because I do think that that's definitely going to help a lot of people with visual and hearing loss. But for me, podcasts are really good. I really love sort of entrepreneur to really be inspired by other entrepreneurs. So I'm really a big fan of Stephen Bartlett's podcasts and all of his guests that he has on there. And so, yeah, I think personally, I'm not someone that really enjoys reading, and that's not because of my visual impairment. I just think I'd rather listen to something. And podcasts is sort of my thing. So it's definitely Stephen Bartlett. I think I'm very inspired by him as an entrepreneur, and also the content that he puts out. And I just love the way he is as an entrepreneur. And I sort of, as a person that is young and mixed race and has a disability and identifies as LGBT, I'm ticking all the boxes, So so I just really inspired by what he's achieved.
Brilliant. And I'll try and find a link to that and put it into the show notes. So if you could go back to younger Dan at whatever age suits you, but what advice would you give to you?
And I think that was really, really, I really sort of I think one thing that I would say when I was younger actually is to thank my mother for always pushing me and never wrapping me up in cotton wool just because I had a disability. I was always, if I would fall over, I'd always get back up again, or I'd have sort of kids maybe knocking off my glasses in the playground, but I always had broad shoulders, and I think that was always my mother, because she didn't wrap me up in cotton wool. And that sort of made me who I am today, quite robust and quite resilient. But also I think having a disability has allowed me to be resilient and not let people bother me too much. And so, I think in many ways it's allowed me to express myself, be who I am, and, maybe I was born this way.
Fair enough. Dan, thank you so much for being so open and generous with your insights and knowledge. If anybody wants to get in touch with you, how would they go about doing it?
So you can contact me at daniel@visualizetrainingandconsultancy.co.uk or www.visualizetrainingandconsultancy.co.uk.
That's perfect. I think you're also on LinkedIn and things like that as well, aren't you? So no, that's brilliant. So before we go, don't forget that Ergonomics Human Factors 2023 is at the end of April. More information and tickets can be found at ergonomics.org.uk, and there's a range of topics as well as fascinating keynotes. The first day is a choice of masterclasses, doctoral consortium, or the careers fair, and then we get into the conference proper. And the social side is back with this quiz and the annual dinner, and I hope to see some of you there. Thank you all for listening and watching, whatever platform and channel you're absorbing this through. Please do share your questions and comments through the channel that you're using, and we look forward to seeing you in the next.
Thank you for listening to 1202, the Human Factors Podcast. Please do get in touch with your thoughts, questions, and comments. You can contact us on social media such as Twitter, LinkedIn, and Facebook at 1202 Podcast. See you next time. And remember, it's more than just common sense.